Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being there. I'd like to thank the organizers, especially the museum and EUROPALIA, for this conference, mostly for welcoming me on board. My thanks go more specifically to my emeritus head of service, Dr. Patricia van Schulenburg, for her support, to Professor Johan Lega for his guidance, and my colleagues Christine Bluar and Eva Bialek for their hard work to set up this day. The content of this research is intended as a support for an academic discussion. Topic of studies and quoted material may reflect the perception of past times and centuries. As such, this paper may contain mature themes not suitable for all audiences, or that may be shocking to their own belief or trigger unwelcome feelings. This is without prejudice for the speaker and the partners or institution the speaker is connected to. And of course, no infringement intended. Through a detailed analysis of a set of archives, the present paper, which is still an ongoing research, hope to highlight how even before the first pickaxing or even blueprint layout, the history and the transnationality of the future Congo Railway was a reality through the various actors involved in its financing. Even before gathering laborers, international engineers, international wealthy tourists, local porters, local workers in need of transportation, or local transborders travelers, the history and failure of looking for funds and how to fund the railway was a complicated international story in itself. Stanley returned to Europe in 1877 after his transcontinental journey from East Central Africa and onward to the West Coast, having achieved his circumnavigation of the Lake Victoria and his descent of the Congo River. This gave Leopold II the opportunity to give concrete foundations to his colonial dream. Even before the publication of Stanley's book Through the Dark Continent, the head of the King's Cabinet discreetly obtained the first map, the first printed map laid out in Europe, showing the course of the Congo through the Daily Telegraph, the co-sponsor of Stanley's voyage through Central Africa. This is actually a map from the said book, but from the German print publication. And about this map, it's kind of interesting because despite some errors and geographical approximation in the mapping, the course of the Congo was a stunning revelation for Europe. As soon as Stanley arrived in Europe, the king entourage contacted the traveler. From June 1878 onwards, Baron Grindel organized a series of interviews to sound out Stanley on a possible mission on behalf of Leopold II and to gain a better understanding of this immense geographical basin and its potential. Stanley's proposal, in essence, was to build a railway that would bypass the rapids of the lower Congo and thus allow the Malipo Pool to be easily connected to the ports on the Atlantic coast in order to reach the interior of Africa, thanks to the massive navigable artery that the Congo River is. Stanley, who presented himself as an American but remained Welsh at heart, rather expected Great Britain to take an interest in his geographical endeavors, but saw his motherland reluctantly turn away from the Congo Basin. Stanley worked hard to get the English Chambers of Commerce interested in the Congo Basin, especially Manchester, which cotton goods were used as a bargaining chip in Central Africa. Faced with the indifference of England, which was more interested in the east of Central Africa and the connection Cape Cairo, Stanley eventually agreed to be the main tool in Leopold's plan, with a 5-year contract which the king could terminate at any time, and for an annual salary of £1,000, when he was on African soil. I'd like first to focus now on the train actually as an instrument of economical development. Stanley knew the importance of the train for the economic development of both Great Britain and Europe on one hand and the United States on the other, but the entire perception and the entire discourse connected, propaganda discourse connected to the train, of course, focus on Central Africa. He relied on the railway to tap the existing wealth of the Congo basin. The construction of a railway was an obvious necessity in order to bypass the 300 kilometers long cataracts between the pool and the port on the coast. Draining trade from the interior of Central Africa and from the upper Congo was a constant for Stanley. In his strategic plan, the Congo had to be the central artery, and the railway had to ensure the continuity and fluidity and the flow of the trade. It was only a question of establishing a mean of communication with the interior to gain direct access to agricultural and natural raw resources such as palm oil, timber, and ivory, and of course later on rubber and copper. Thus bypassing what was perceived as numerous intermediary and ergo a disruption caused by portage. What in reality would eventually, during the 20th century, bring disruption in itself, especially for local economic grounds and local population. From July to October 1878, Grindle and Stanley worked regularly on a railway project in Lower Congo. Several meetings took place, some of which attended by the king himself. They discussed technical means, manpower, and staff to be found before departure, and of course, finances. Stanley had to answer questions about the topography of the Central African tableland and the Congo basin. He had to present studies to the committees and make technical proposals. It was probably in the context of these studies that Stanley became interested in the monorailway of J.K. Collett in Cardiff. So you have here a set of sketches from Stanley in the Stanley archive, roughly describing the geographical and topographical element of the area. And here you have the Collett's plans for a monorailway. His simplest model, which is interesting, especially and among others, because of how it was titled, this is the so-called pioneer or small colonial railway. So I think the emphasis here is absolutely striking. So this model was designed precisely for countries seeking a cheaper and quicker solution to build than the classical ordinary railway. The inventor drawings for this system reached Stanley when he was in Africa in August 1880. Oops, there it is. So the railway was the first choice of infrastructure to be created, according to Stanley, and that was an opinion which you can find among the king's entourage pretty fastly. He suggested that preparatory meeting before his appointment with the king, and his emphasis is always spot on the need for a railway. He wrote about it in his diary and no doubt talked about it in England too, as we find echoes of these interests in his correspondence, among others with James Hutton, a Manchester businessman and president-to-be of the Chamber of Commerce. And I quote here a colleague, Chamberlain, an extremely influential man who had a finger in most African pies, end of quote. England was the most industrialized nation at the time, the world's leading trading power. It alone developed a significant amount of trade. It had trading factories and commercial houses at the mouth of the Congo and regular maritime links with Liverpool. The direct or indirect British trade with the Congo and adjoining coast in 1883-84 was about £2 million. England also thought to capture the African Great Lakes trades, and from there, the one in the Upper Congo. English traders were therefore ideal partners to form a group of investors with expertise in financial arrangements. They were especially eager to develop the African trade in the hope of countering the English depressed textile industry. The letters exchanged between Grindel and the then president of the AIA and Stanley were very short and cryptic enough to make it difficult to fully grasp what exactly Grindel meant, using terms such as business, or what precisely the scheme of the project was, as the king put it. In fact, the king did not wish to divulge his project and would do everything to keep it under the radar, especially internationally, forbidding Stanley to breathe the word in England unless questioned by Lord Beacon, aka Prime Minister Disraeli himself. This desire or need for secrecy to shelter the royal project will be a brake on its development. From the outset, the king's Congolese project suffered from a lack of funding. It is obvious that by preferring to act alone, in secrecy, the king necessarily deprived himself of international financing. Stanley lists the name of few peoples the king invited to the second study meeting, apart from Grindel and Schouw, who was to replace Grindel as the head of the AIA. There was the NAHV with two Rotterdam businessmen, Pinkoff and Kardec, who were very involved in trading between Europe and Africa on a large scale. Oh yeah, another map here. Oops, that was not here. Okay, yeah, where was I? Sorry. There was also the king's banker, Lambert from the Rothschild Bank, Hutton of Manchester, and Belgian industrialist Sabatier. Apart from Pinkoff and Kardec, who were willing to put £8,000 into the project, but soon left the venture due to their very own bankruptcy, and Lambert, who managed the king finances, it is not known what the other would put in. The bankruptcy of Pinkoff and Kardec caused the departure of a chain of other investor and banker, among other things Baroness Coutts, which makes the king momentarily pause and hesitate to pursue his project. You have here a caricature about Pinkoff and Kardec's bankruptcy. The provisional budget allocated to Stanley for the total execution of the project was a mere £20,000 in the first year and £8,000 in the following 2 years. Nothing is said beyond the third year. In comparison, here is a budget proposed the same year by James Bradshaw, an English journalist, for the construction of the East Central African Railway from Zanzibar to Lake Victoria. The author recommends the creation of an African corporation with a capital of £10 million, with the opening of the capital to small shareholders of England, Ireland, and Scotland in order to interest the whole nation in the project. One can immediately see the difference in scale and policy between Zanzibar Lake Victoria Railway budget projects and what was discussed in Brussels. The aim was to expand the market for British manufactured goods. Again, nothing is said about local population here and about the need for travelers to move through the railway. Financially, the train made it possible to reduce the cost of transport of goods while increasing the quantity transported. However, it was not with the derisory budget the king suggested that it was possible to build a railway in Lower Congo. Such a project could only and possibly be realized through joint venture, in which English investors were ready to engage, and which explained Hutton's presence in Brussels. A letter from Hutton to Stanley, dated January 1879, shows the international network of private finance in action. It was the Dutch Pincoff and Kerdijk who alerted Hutton, and then he himself received a direct request from Leopold II to look for, quote, men of influence, in other words, bankers. Leopold desires not to appear, while remaining in full control of the project, rule out any international serious cooperation at the financial level. For any businessman, it is necessary to discuss openly on solid basis. Given the lack of funding for this railway, the project was abandoned, and the construction of 3 stations and the establishment of communication without specifying which one was deemed sufficient. So it was the Franco-Belgian colonial rivalry in the region that revived the railway project from mid-1881. The boost given by Brussels to the Congolese project was the result of the arrival of France in the direct scramble for Central Africa, where Leopold II had felt he had no rival until then. This drove the king to increase his sight on the Congo basin and to reconsider the funds sparingly allocated to his project until then. And I quote here a passage from Stanley's diary. I, Stanley, am to reconsider the, Stanley, am to altogether not displeased that de Brazza has secured a share of the Congo for France, because had he not appeared, His Majesty would probably have starved our enterprise and still kept us within the limit of £12,000. In Stanley's mind, this competition will benefit the construction of the railway. Quote, well, old Africa will benefit this competition, and civilization will come all the sooner through rivalry, and that railway which Grindel and I labored for during July, August, September, and October 1878 will be made the sooner. Leopold II is ready to increase his financial efforts in the Congo to be sure of winning the concession of territories along the river. Avalanches of orders arrived from Brussels to Stanley in this sense, and to motivate him, it was always the hope of establishing a railway that was agitated. Territorial concession should serve as a guarantee for obtaining capital in Europe. Without such concession, he wrote, we shall be unable to obtain the goodwill, to obtain the capital for our railway to the pool. In April '82, a few weeks before falling very seriously ill, and which forced Stanley to interrupt his mission and return to Europe for a few weeks, Stanley did not despair of seeing the railway become a reality. And he wrote, I am looking forward to the railway, which we discussed for months in 1878, becoming something more than a subject for talks. It was still necessary to find a group of investors who would be satisfied with promises of vague land concession as guarantees. In August '84, when Stanley had finally returned to England at the end of May and the Berlin Conference was being prepared, the idea of building a railway resurfaced yet again. This time it was Count Borchgrave of Altena, the king's secretary, who was in charge. And he wrote, we have consulted with different bankers, and they are no disinclined to furnish the new state with the necessary money for the railway. But of course, they can't promise anything before we can give them a memorandum on the wealth of the country, and on the quantity of goods to be transported, and also on the direct taxes the new independent states could collect in its different provinces. The memorandum arrived on the king's desk 8 days later. Note the quote, in the quote, the use of the term direct taxes on the state of Congo, as it was not possible to levy indirect taxes on goods. Contacts will continue for a year. During that time, Stanley must be made patient as he's wondering about his future. He had to be spared as he was an excellent intermediary with the British business community and in unofficial political contacts. As Borchgrave wrote to Stanley in May '85, As soon as it is officially notified that the king has taken in hand the direction of the new state of Congo, I will let you know. I should much like to inform you that the railway question is progressing. I intend writing then to consult you on this all-important point for the future of the Congo. End of quote. Leopold II's personal sovereignty over the Congo was the first recognized at the Berlin Conference in February '85, but was not officially communicated to the chancelleries and the diplomatical channel until the end of July '85. As always, the search for capital preoccupied the king, and borrowing remained a possibility. Borgrav in March '85 wrote, "It would indeed be a very good thing if large capitalists were to subscribe a loan to the new state for the construction of the railway. It is therefore necessary to consider turning to the English financial power again." The creation of the railway in the Congo thus became an international political instrument for two reasons. On one hand, it was necessary not to offend the Brits, who were the potential investors, and not to criticize the international financial backer, who might have political demands that would limit Leopold's power and freedom of actions. On the other hand, the train would serve the king's political ambition in his rivalry with the French colonization of the Congo and his aim to extend the so-called Congo Free State. Stanley was obviously the right man to listen to the business circle, as well as a valued piece in the international chessboard. The wealthy Baroness Barrett Counts, one of the potential investor, is ready to be back in the capital at one condition. She wishes the presence of Stanley in the meeting, but, quote, "agents of the independent state of Congo should carefully abstain from taking any part in the meeting where the acts of the British or any other governments are censored." In July '85, Stanley wrote to Borgrav undiplomatically, to say the least, how he felt about the railway being unceasingly postponed. Quote, "To tell you the truth, I considered it highly politic to excite the societies, religious, commercial, agricultural, colonial, etc., etc., who have an interest in the Congo state. The principal object of the meeting was to Congo the Nile by way of Swakin. I diverted the attention of the promoters to the Congo for the simple reason that the more people of all classes found the Congo serviceable, the sooner we should have our railway to Upper Congo. At present, we have the Congo state, 3 mission societies, the French government, and Bakongo traders interested in the Upper Congo, which is the usual rate imposed in the new countries, would suffice to pay expenses, but no dividend. If we can open the Nile to a Gordon association via the Congo, we have a custom to the extent of about 5,000 a year. The Church Missionary Society, with its Nile mission, would be another 2,000 a year. An American society that proposes to commence work with another 1,000, colonists of the Upper Congo from America, about 10,000 commercial traders, a whole army of them, all bound for the Upper River District, thus adding to the railway revenue and that of the state. Without the railway revenue of the state at 5% on export, will never exceed 20,000 per annum. With the railway, the revenue will increase to the first year after the opening of £100,000 to £500,000 a few years later. This is the whole secret. Without a railway, the state cannot thrive. When you at Brussels have perfectly understood this and have commenced to earnestly realize this, it will be a happy moment for me. End of quote. At the King's request, Stanley had obediently formed the Congo Railway Syndicate, mainly with Hutton and William Mackinnon, the founder of the British India Steam Navigation Company, but it led nowhere. In January '86, Stanley, despite pressing letter to the King, received no response that would allow the syndicate to become more involved. The syndicate wanted Stanley to lead the construction of the railway, so hoped Stanley too, but the King did not want a foreign interference in his young state Congolese Affair. In February '86, Stanley was awarded the Cross of Grand Officer of the Order of Leopold for recognition of his work in Congo. And his railway project, as was not pursued. Works eventually started in 1890. At that time, Stanley, back for good in UK, had already turned the page and was not to ever return to the Congo Basin, nor be associated with the Congolese Railway. And I'm going to stop there.
Today I will talk to you about the Tazara Railway. The Tazara Railway is a 1,700-kilometer long railway built between Zambia and Tanzania by the People's Republic of China between 1970 and 1975. The railway was built to overcome the isolation that followed Zambia independence in 1964. As you can understand, Tazara is the acronym of Tanzanian Zambian Railway Authority. And I decided to start this presentation by showing you this picture, which I took in the Tazara headquarters of Dar es Salaam in 2018. And so here in the headquarters, you could see this very nice chart of the traffic performance of the railway. But on top of that, there's the portrait of the three men who made the railway project possible. So on the left, you see President Nyerere of Tanzania. In the middle, you see Chairman Mao of China. And on the right, the Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first president of independent Zambia. But before getting to the details of the project, I think I need to give you a bit of context. So Zambia, which you see marked in this map with this circle, was called Northern Rhodesia in the colonial era and was, as you can see, part of the British South Africa colony. Northern Rhodesia was first conquered and later administered from the south through Southern Rhodesia and South Africa through the railway, we can say. First, the territory was administered by the British South Africa Company of Cecil Rhodes, this British megalomaniac who gave its name to the railway, which was called the Rhodesia Railway, and to the state itself. So Southern and Northern Rhodesia were both named after him. And later by the British government, who purchased the land from Cecil Rhodes himself. As you can see from the map on the right, during the colonial era, Northern Rhodesia outlet to the sea was the Rhodesia Railway, linking the mining region of the Zambian copper belt to the ports of South Africa. Copper played a fundamental role in the economy, both of the colonial Rhodesia and of independent Zambia. In fact, in 1960, Northern Rhodesia was the third largest copper producer in the world, and its exports constitute over 50% of the government revenues. Here you see a map of Northern Rhodesia, and you can see the presence of the railway crossing the country from southwest, Southern Rhodesia, to the north, or to the border with the Belgian Congo. And you can also see that along the railway, the colonial administration defined different types of land. What you see in gray was defined as crown land, which was the land available to white settlers, while the rest of the colony was defined as native reserves and native trust land. As you can see from this map, the majority of urban centers, which are the dot in the map, including the capital Lusaka, were also located along the railway. And all the productive activities, including the mines of the copper belt, which is this concentration of dot you see in the north of Zambia, were also located along the line of rail. So we can see how the railway was informing the territorial structure of Northern Rhodesia. But at the same time, we also see how the railway was somehow defining who and what could move in Northern Rhodesia. Namely, white settlers were allowed to move and to export their goods, while native Africans were not allowed to access the railway. So as you can see from this map, it's quite clear how the Rhodesia Railway became the backbone of the country's uneven structure, territorial structure. And furthermore, this south-north orientation of the railway was also reflecting the political and economic dependency that Zambia had on Southern Rhodesia and South Africa for its export mainly, and import, of course. This geopolitical constellation changed in 1964 as Zambia became independent and had to secure a new outlet to the sea. At this point, Zambia was surrounded by colonial states like Southern Rhodesia, Angola, Malawi, and Mozambique. And it was bordering the Congo, which was named Zaire at the time of this map, as you can see, which was, of course, independent already since 1960, but it was considered a very unstable country. And furthermore, it was competing with Zambia on the copper market. So it was not considered a viable ally for the construction of the new outlet. Of course, there were already railways linking the Congolese copper mine region, but they were already overcrowded with the export of the Congolese copper. And therefore, to overcome the situation, President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia envisioned to reroute the national import-export toward Tanzania to the northeast, and then to connect to the Indian Ocean. Tanzania was already independent, and its first president, Julius Nyerere, which we saw in the first picture, shared Kaunda's socialist and Pan-African principles. The two countries that had been historically separated by arbitrary colonial administration, we can say, agreed to cooperate to the construction of the Tanzam railway. The railway was expected to be the most efficient means of transport, the one that would make the country most reliant. The idea was that, in fact, once the railway was built, it was not supposed to require much import of fossil fuels or vehicles. At the same time, the railway matched the idea of the strong state, which both socialist countries shared, and the idea of a hierarchical structured territory that was centrally controlled by the state. The two newly independent countries, though, lacked the funding and the expertise to build the railway, and started therefore to search for foreign donors able to help with the project. Here in this slide, you see on the left, President Kaunda discussing with Lyndon Johnson, the US president, at the White House. And on the right, you actually see a nationalist page reporting on Nyerere's visit to China. So many Western countries refused to help Zambia and Tanzania realize the project, because the railway was considered too expensive, but also the situation of Zambia isolation was considered a temporary one. So many Western donors didn't see the need for this railway. But on the other hand, the People's Republic of China decided to support the project and agreed to finance and build the railway. China offered a very generous interest-free loan payable in 30 years after 20 years of grace period. The construction of the railway was indeed a huge endeavor that required not only the laying of the tracks, but also the construction of 300 bridges, 21 tunnels, the construction of 93 stations of different sizes, as you can see here, from the head station of Dar es Salaam to smaller ones, located along the line, but also the construction of headquarters with offices, housing for workers, and workshop. China also provided wagons and locomotives, and the training of local personnel who was trained on how to operate, maintain, and fix the trucks, the wagons, and the locomotives. And in the 5 years of construction, it was estimated that over 56,000 Chinese and local workers took part to the construction. But as architecture theoretician Keller Easterling observed, infrastructure are the medium in Marshall McLuhan's famous dictum, and I quote, "The medium is the message." This means that what the medium is saying, and I quote, is sometimes preventing us from seeing what the medium is doing. With this, I mean that the Tazara Railway was, of course, used as a tool of propaganda by both the Chinese and African states, and it embodied different meanings for all the different actors involved. All this while, of course, doing something else. The Chinese named the railway the Freedom Railway. They consider it a project of South-South help and a common third world struggle against imperialist and neo-colonial forces. Indeed, the construction of the railway marked the beginning of a new geopolitical alliance, but in reality, China was also searching for new political allies and commercial partners, especially after the Sino-Soviet split of the early 60s. And indeed, the railway came with a series of commercial agreements that imposed Chinese goods to African markets. And as we can see on the right, Chinese goods going far beyond train wagons and locomotives. It included bicycles and drinks. But the railway had other meanings for other groups or people. The Zambian government called the railway the Freedom Railway, and claimed that the project served to overcome the country dependency on the white controlled country and to decolonize the existing territorial structure that was defined by the colonial railway. It's interesting to notice that they thought to decolonize the land through the same infrastructure that was used to actually colonize the land in the first place. Furthermore, the Zambian state also used the railway for its nation building project. The railway meant that the new state was real, was efficient, and was working for its citizen, and it was able to materialize its promise of development. Of course, also the government was expecting the railway to increase agricultural production and to open up the areas crossed by the line. But by Zambia and Tanzania, both, the new railway was also sold as a Pan-African project, the result of a successful cooperation between independent African states, which were as good as Siamese twin, we can read in the Zambian newspaper. Indeed, in the 60s, the Pan-African ideology claimed that cooperation between African nations was a way of overcoming the fragmentation that was brought to Africa by colonial powers, and which was also the reason of Africa's underdevelopment. So the idea was, if fragmentation was the cause of underdevelopment, cooperation will surely help us develop. Of course, the railway had a broader impact. As soon as China decided to build the railway, the World Bank and the US aid decided to improve the existing road link between Zambia and Tanzania. And in the same years, a pipeline along the same route was built by the Italian oil company. So these three infrastructure constituted what is now called as the Dar es Salaam corridor. So we can see how the railway actually had consequences also on infrastructural development. But of course, also for the population of Tanzania and Zambia, the railway had a different impact. In Zambia, the railway crossed sparsely populated areas, while in Tanzania, it crossed a rich agricultural region. The railway in the year mainly came to serve Tanzanian farmers living along the line, who use it as a tool of transport to export their agricultural produce, and by a small local entrepreneur who use it to import goods from the port of Dar es Salaam. So even though the country claimed that the railway was going to be a tool of self-reliance, it's actually quite interesting to notice that rather than a collective self-reliance, the railway actually supported a sort of individual self-reliance. And of course, the railway had an impact on the territorial structure, but it was not as structuring as the colonial Rhodesia Railway had been. Because of course, at the time after independence, the competition with road transport was higher. Indeed, nowadays, most of Zambia's copper is exported through trucks, partially on the Dar es Salaam corridor, but also through Angola and through South Africa again. So in conclusion, I would like to notice how it is hard to define univocally the meaning and result of this post-colonial project. Indeed, China did support the claim of independent states who aimed at decolonizing their territory, but reproduced a project and a territorial vision based on the extraction of Africa's resources at the global scale, because in the end, the main goal of the railway was the export of copper. But interestingly, on the long run, things evolved in different and unexpected ways, and the Tazara, even though is still facing constant economic difficulties, is a public facility that finds hard to compete with private trucks company. So we see how this this one project is actually carrying a lot of different meaning and troubles, and how it can be interpreted in different ways by different users. And I conclude with this. Thank you.
Thank you to both speakers. Now I have the task to respond to both presentations, and before we move on to the actual discussion of this first session. And of course, it is not an easy task to find common denominators between such different presentations spanning a period of almost 100 years and also looking at very different projects on the African continent. But I would like to address a couple of points that might be interesting for our discussion later on. And I think what became visible in both presentations by Mathilde and by Giulia is the question of stakeholders that were behind the projects, and what, for instance, would be perhaps one of the first questions that I would like to address is the role of individual power brokers, which was probably very clear in Mathilde's presentation if we consider the prominent role of Stanley mediating between the Belgian king and potential investors. But I also wonder to what extent perhaps this could be said about the three men who made the Tazara Railway project possible, because I think it also has a different connotation and a different meaning beyond individual power broking. And if we think about stakeholders, then I think what also needs to be considered in the discussion is the question of their different rationales and motivations, and if we connect it to particular railway projects, then of course what becomes visible is the question of territorial concessions, and they're very different genealogies. So I was also wondering if we can perhaps establish links between approaches to ownership and concessions from the colonial period to the early post-colonial period. What also is a common denominator between the two presentations is the question of capital, and related to that, the question of debt that was, of course, inherent in one way or another to every railway project, although I think we also need to nuance here if we speak about the role of foreign donors and investors. So actually this inherent question of debt was something that made me think about, for instance, Martin Arboleda's work on extractive capitalism. So I'm referring to his monograph on planetary mine, which is not connected in any way to the colonial history of Africa, but seems, in my opinion, to describe very similar processes of extractive capitalism. And while considering extractive capitalism, I think it is also interesting to look more carefully at different vectors of power, but also different vectors of mobility and movements of, for instance, capital and goods. And I'm relating that to what Giulia described in her presentation as inlets and outlets, because I think it became visible that there were very different directions and scales related to this Tazara Railway project. And maybe as a final point that I would like to highlight here, it would be also about questioning this imperative of railway as the most efficient mode of transportation, because I believe the danger would be here that we just take it for granted, following, for instance, the rationale as it was conveyed to potential investors. But if we consider even early discussions from, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, but also later on, I think the picture becomes much more complicated, and that was also something that was mentioned in Giulia's presentation. If we, for instance, think about how the Tazara Railway project was embedded in this larger network of transportation, including the development of roads. So I think that is also part of this larger scale of railway projects that have to be considered, along with reconsidering different vectors of power. And of course, if we speak about Chinese presence on the continent and look at the encompassing scale of the activity of Chinese stakeholders, I think it might be also important to relate it to the question of neo-colonial presence of actors from outside the African continent, and also long-term dependencies that were created in the immediate post-independence period, but that also date back to dependencies already existing throughout colonial times. So that would be my list of points that could be seen as common denominators, but also as points worth considering in the discussion. So, if you want to immediately respond.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thank you for such a detailed analysis and making indeed the jump between our research, Giulia and myself. It does put a set of elements that you pushed forward. International presence within, communication, railway systems, etc., and stakeholder for me are indeed key. I think that it's absolutely fascinating the fact that it was there at the end of the 19th century, and it's still there almost 150 years afterwards. What does it say about us? I really don't know. I'm a trained historian, so just ask me about 19th century and maybe I'll be able to answer. But what it might say actually is the difficulty for us all, whether we're local or international stakeholders or just, people in the know or people who wants to know, we seem to have a difficulty to reinvent ourselves and to reinvent the capability of creating at the same time a network of physical connection and a network of transportation, may be people or finance or goods. Maybe we simply are not imaginative enough, or maybe we're too reliant on a way of functioning which is indeed a little passé at best, or still deeply rooted in the 19th century. The stakeholder thing, though, is that until we're still in a capitalist system these days. So if you want to renew your function, your railway or transportation system, I can't figure out who or how much can come without an international participation to this situation, may it be through the World Bank, may it be through a classical 19th century fundraising as Stanley was doing it. At some point, you still need to pay your worker, you still need to pay for the elements to build and to modernize the system. I'm afraid I'm coming here with much more question to your question than answers there. It's probably a question to be asked maybe more to cooperation, development aid workers and element like that, or a classically trained economist than myself. I'm afraid, yeah, I have more question than answer at this point.
Giulia, do you want to add more questions from the vantage point of architectural history?
Thank you, Monika. Actually, more than question, I was actually happy that you made this very nice analysis, and you point a few things that I might have mentioned, but I'm not sure it's never clear enough that this was clearly an extractive capitalist project. And this needs to be remarked, because despite all the meanings and the Pan-African collaboration and the South-South aid, this was clearly a project made for the benefit, of course, of the Zambian miners. So this needs to be underlined, never enough. And also you mentioned the neo-colonial aspect of the whole project, which was also clearly there. And so this I found was very important to remark. I was also interested in the in the first point you made about the role of individuals, and it's something that I'm really struggling with in a way, because when you try to make a history of early post-colonial Tanzania, which is the main focus of my research, it's really hard to think about the national policy without thinking about Nyerere, who was the first president of the country, but also the man who kind of got to achieve independence in the first place. And his figure is really dominant in the discourse. And it's really hard to understand what he really did and what he actually just was representing back then. So I realized that, yeah, of course, there's a big presence. These figures have played a key role, although it's not very clear what was their role on the ground, so to say. I'm sure that Chairman Mao was not very involved in the project, but so yeah, that's an interesting point. And but we should also not forget that the Tanzanian state was much more, and the Zambian state was much more than the president himself. And of course, this is a bit of a superficial reading of the geopolitical project. And yeah, I guess. And another very interesting point you made is questioning railways as the most efficient means of transport. In the case of the Dar es Salaam transport corridor, it's actually interesting to notice how there's two different ideas of most efficient transport. So while the Chinese helped build the railway, the American helped the reconstruction of the highway, which is also showing that there is not a best option, but rather, but this is also an ideological position, right? I mean, the US seemed to support a more neoliberal idea of transport based on private mobility, while the socialist state was actually thinking about the railway as the best means of transport. So it's interesting to notice how this is not a merely technological issue, but it's also based on ideology, I would say. So yeah, that would be an interesting question to ask for all the projects we've been hearing about today, and we will hear. We heard yesterday, and we will hear today as well. I don't know if there's more questions.
If there is some question in the room, and we can also invite Professor Nyenzi to join the question moment.
Hi Mathilde, hi Emma. Thank you for your outstanding presentation. Thank you also, Ms. Scotto. I have a question for Mathilde. And what the archive says, can you elaborate the accuracy of drawing of Stanley? Regarding this accuracy, was used by Leopold II directly at the Conference of Berlin, because of course, this accuracy of drawing was directly the consequence of him at the Conference of Berlin buying at Portugal Cabinda and of course l'embouchure du fleuve. So it gives, I think, us idea of how train was directly the consequence of the reshaping of the country and of the embouchure. So simply one guys who can with its a standing drawing of architecture of landscape, and then he gives the idea to the king to I have to buy this to make some tractation, because of course he has information that Portugal didn't know about that, and it gives also an idea of necropolitic, as Emma said, because of course Cabinda is an enclave, and there's also a lot of, it's not about railway, but the gold on it, but how his drawing has a geopolitical consequence. What the archive says about that, and also what the archive says about the presence of Chinese worker at the construction from Matadi to Boma, and there was some Chinese worker. And is it in Congo that they know how to basically put some train, or maybe it was in US, because of course, as you know, Stanley, grew up in New Orleans, in USA, and there's of course a real tradition in the West from Chinese work on the railroad, and what the archive says about that, and of course, Chinese workers was also part of that necropolitic, as Emma says, in US and also in Congo. So maybe it's on that two sides that they learn about the past, and maybe it will be a good consequence of what they are doing to do right now in Zambia or back in the day. Thank you for responding.
Thank you, François, for this very rich and dense set of questions. I'll try to be brief. Of course, I'm always at your disposal, all of you. If you have any sets of questions, I'm just an email away. So regarding the accuracy of Stanley's geographical sketches. So what is interesting is that it's not necessarily the archive themselves, but rather the work we've done later on, with all the GIS and satellite imagery that we had, that allowed us to try to better understand, indeed that sort of accuracy rate. There were some mistakes, and but surprisingly, his drawings, especially in terms of landscape and mapping, were pretty accurate for the time, especially considering the lack of techniques that he had, were basically in the 19th century. You have a sextant, you have a theodolite, and that's pretty much it. You have a compass. So it was quite fascinating indeed, the level of detail he was capable of adding to some of his sketches. The interesting thing, though, is that eventually the final maps that were used at the Berlin conference, Stanley was not the printer. So there was a set of other intermediary moving from his sketches to the final maps. You had a set of extra geographical researchers coming up, mixing his maps with other maps by other travelers, other printed maps. Then that eventually led to the map as we know it, used in 84, 85. And some of those maps actually still had mistake. There was a lake, for example, that, as far as I know, was never there in the first place in Central Africa. So there are still elements, geographical elements, that were added based on previous records or previous geographical expeditions that afterwards were deleted or put back on tracks. So that's definitely one of the element. But indeed, I mean, his knowledge of the field, because he went there in the first place, and the fact that he brought back those very precise sketches, according to me, were key, not just to Leopold II, but also all the powers at that time, to better understand how the Congo River was simply key to the scramble for Africa. So regarding, among other things, the Chinese workers and the influence of the U.S. railway vision at that time, very fascinating question indeed. So the thing is that Stanley's involvement with the railway was mostly through capital funding and through searching for funding, not the construction itself, even though at some point he hoped he would be in charge of that. But it stopped really in 86. The construction itself started 4 years later. And at that point, he was not working in 90 up to 98. He was not working for the king anymore. And so his involvement locally in terms of the construction who was there, the description of the forced labor, the description of the layout on the land, all that is not in the archive simply because he was not there and nor involved at that time. Nevertheless, it is absolutely true what you said about how important what was going on in the US was formative in Stanley's mind. The entire expansion toward the West in the US was, among other things, based on the railway. And Stanley was in the US at that time. And so this sort of what was perceived in his mind as a successful development of the railway to support the emergence of the US as an international, or at least a continental superpower, well, that would become a superpower. It's true that in some way you do find echoes into Stanley's plan regarding the Congo. Like without the Congo, without the railway, the Congo cannot strive. It's absolutely an echo of what was going on and how the US eventually and heavily invested on the railway system. And so you do find that too, indeed, like look what's going on in the US in terms of financing the work, financing the Industrial Revolution, financing the railway, who's working there. So all those mechanisms, you can find traces of that indeed on during some of the meetings, preparatory meetings Stanley was part of.
Okay, thank you. We'll have a next question.
Moi, ma question est pour Dr. Emma Ronienisi, donc je l'ai dit en français. Merci beaucoup pour votre contribution que j'ai trouvée vraiment fascinante. Je vais essayer de formuler mes questions de manière assez courte. La première, ça concerne, vous avez parlé de la violence qui s'épuise en suicide collectif et lutte fratricide. Vous avez cité Frantz Fanon. J'aurais aimé que vous puissiez développer ce point et je ne sais pas s'il existe des études là-dessus, peut-être citer d'autres auteurs qu'on pourrait lire pour approfondir la question. La deuxième question, ça concerne le projet du libre-échange en Afrique de l'Est et avec le Congo aujourd'hui. Étant donné... j'ai lu dernièrement que le président du Rwanda avait signalé à l'Union africaine qu'il voulait récupérer une partie du Congo, de l'Est du Congo. Je ne sais pas si vous avez eu cette information. J'aurais aimé que vous commentiez aussi peut-être ce point-là au vu de l'actualité politique actuelle. Et... je ne sais plus. Attends. Oui, et aussi, que fait-on des débris coloniaux ? Vous avez abordé cette question, mais de manière très rapide, et j'ai vraiment pas eu le temps de simplement capter l'information. Donc, j'avoue, j'aurais aimé que vous repreniez ce point-là, si c'est possible. Merci.
Oui, merci. Oui, j'utilise chez Fanon les questions de suicide collectif ou de guerre fratricide de manière métaphorique. Hein. C'est un psychiatre ou psychanalyste, oui, je pense. Et c'est très intéressant de voir le rapport entre ce qu'on appelle à l'est du Congo les guerres ethniques ou interethniques, ces guerres qui donnent en fait cette image coloniale de noirs, comme un peu c'est le cas, je l'ai lu dernièrement dans le rapport sur les mains coupées de 1905, hein, cette idée de population noire cannibale, ou alors qui sont en train de se tuer tout le temps et qui ont besoin des processus de paix, d'organisation, de pacification. Mais ce qui ne se fait pas malheureusement, c'est vraiment le rapport entre les formes de biopolitique qui sont suscitées et le fait que les gens à la fin arrivent à s'entremanger. C'est-à-dire, lorsque vous avez des milliards de dollars qui sont alloués à des programmes comme la MONUSCO, qui est là depuis 20 ans, mais qui n'a jamais rien pacifié, des dettes qui sont en train de s'accumuler autour des grands projets de Bukangalonzo, plus de 400 millions de dollars pour des grands projets, ça ne fonctionne pas. Et la part du budget national autour des secteurs sociaux, comme l'agriculture, la santé et l'éducation, rien du tout pour un budget de 7 milliards de dollars. On ne fait jamais le lien entre ces gros projets qui sont finalement idéologiques et le manque d'investissement dans les secteurs sociaux et le rapport entre ce carence et ce qu'on appelle les guerres intercommunautaires. Et donc l'enjeu, c'est de voir comment ce discours modernisateur, d'ailleurs à l'époque de Kabila, on a eu ce programme de la révolution de la modernisation pour dire qu'on est vraiment dans cette idée que le bien-être des gens va sortir de la croissance et la croissance va ressortir des grands projets d'investissement comme dans le train, les parcs agro-industriels, etc. Mais on ne montre pas le lien entre l'inefficience de ces projets-là, le manque d'investissement dans des secteurs sociaux, c'est-à-dire la vie de tous les jours des gens qui veulent manger, s'habiller, aller à l'école, etc., et les conflits qui sont là. Et donc, il y a ce rapport entre le fait que les gens se tuent eux-mêmes, la haine du noir contre le noir, comme disait Fanon, et des projets de modernisation ou de la colonisation. Alors, par rapport à la deuxième question, oui, Kagame qui dirait que... Oui, je n'ai pas suivi cette information, mais il faut dire que c'est une partie de trace de la colonisation. Par exemple, les Congolais à l'est du Congo disent que la partie Gatumba vers le Burundi, c'est aux Congolais, c'est Mobutu qui a donné cette partie à l'époque au président burundais. Les échanges de population, Giulia peut en parler beaucoup mieux que moi. On ne peut pas dire qu'il n'y a pas des éléments historiques qui peuvent permettre de comprendre qu'à un moment donné, avant le découpage du territoire congolais, il y avait un maître qui allait soit chez les Rwandais, soit chez les Congolais. On ne peut pas dire ça. L'enjeu, il me semble, c'est qu'est-ce que nous faisons de l'héritage colonial, soit pour vivre en paix, soit pour continuer à nous entremanger. Et finalement, quelles sont nos responsabilités, par exemple, le président congolais, le président rwandais, sur ces genres de questions. Voilà. Donc, de mon point de vue, il n'y a pas une sorte d'essence derrière qui montrerait qu'il y a des frontières congolaises naturelles, etc., qu'on viendrait annexer ou repousser un peu. La question est fondamentalement politique. Et je pense qu'il faut vraiment s'engager dans un débat politique et pacifique avec tous nos voisins autour de ces questions. Parce que je le disais encore à Kinshasa il y a 2 semaines, lorsque vous êtes à Bukavu, vous avez une bonne partie de Congolais de Bukavu qui vont vivre de l'autre côté au Rwanda et qui viennent travailler au Congo. Covid, par exemple, a créé beaucoup de problèmes parce que les mamans du Congo ne pouvaient plus aller prendre leurs marchandises au Rwanda. Et donc, elles ont dû prendre la pirogue. Et malheureusement, il y a eu beaucoup de morts de cette façon-là. Et donc, si vous allez dans la frontière, les gens vivent ensemble. Les gens vivent ensemble. Il y a tellement d'échanges. D'ailleurs, Eva a prononcé mon nom en Kinyarwanda. Nyenyezi, parce que si vous dites Nyenyeri, c'est la même chose, ça veut dire étoile, mais c'est en Kinyarwanda. Avec Z, c'est en Machi. Voilà, pourtant, je suis Mouchi, je ne suis pas Munyarwanda, mais ça veut dire quand même quelque chose en termes d'histoire, d'échange, voire des mélanges. Et je sais la foudre que ces genres de choses peuvent apporter, mais il faut admettre qu'il y a eu des échanges dans des milieux transfrontaliers et qu'il faut en parler. Les gens doivent en parler. Et finalement, la question de débris coloniaux, oui, il y a tout un débat autour de ces restes. Comme à Uvira, par exemple, vous vous baladez et vous rencontrez des rails, des restes matériels ou des questions de frontières jusqu'à aujourd'hui que nous avons, qui datent de la période coloniale. On peut aller de ces questions plutôt matérielles à des questions plutôt idéologiques. Cette idée-là que l'Afrique devrait sortir de la pauvreté grâce à des projets tels que le train, le rail, etc. Lorsque vous en faites la généalogie, vous vous rendez compte que ça s'inscrit non pas seulement dans une temporalité coloniale, mais aussi dans ce qu'on appelle la colonialité globale. Union européenne, gouvernement belge par exemple, la Banque mondiale, etc. Des gens à un moment donné qui mettent en place des référentiels comme manière de voir le monde, un ensemble de valeurs et de normes que les autres qui ont été produits à partir d'un contexte spécifique, mais qu'on va imposer à d'autres populations pour penser leur mode de vie. Et cette rationalité, cette manière de penser l'altérité s'inscrit dans une perspective évolutionniste, encore une fois, où on va considérer au 19e siècle que nous appartenons tous à une race humaine, mais que là-dedans, on a des primitifs, des barbares et les blancs qui connaissent tout, et que tous les autres, les Noirs, etc., pour devenir des vrais humains, doivent s'inspirer des Blancs. Et nous avons toujours ça dans les échanges que nous avons avec, en Europe, l'Europe, les États-Unis, etc., en tout cas l'Occident par rapport à l'Afrique. Cette idée que nous avons la même humanité, au départ, ce qui est chouette, mais que finalement la leur est déjà accomplie. Et que donc, rationnellement, ils sont capables de s'imaginer ce qui est bon pour les autres. Et c'est ça le problème de la colonialité, d'une part, en dehors de l'autre forme de colonialité qui est le fait du pouvoir occidental de manière générale. Et le décolonial pose aujourd'hui la question de mettre fin à ce pouvoir symbolique de l'Occident par rapport au reste du monde. Ouais. Après, on peut continuer ce débat.
Merci beaucoup. Je sais qu'il y a plusieurs questions dans la salle. On est déjà un peu en retard, mais on va quand même prendre la question du professeur Diboué parce que je sais qu'il a vraiment envie de la poser.
Merci. Je poursuis en tout cas les inquiétudes de madame tout à l'heure là, parce que vous avez parlé de la violence du train colonial, si j'ai bien compris. J'ai dit que ce n'est pas un cas spécifique pour Uvira, parce qu'en fait, la construction du chemin de fer depuis 1890 jusqu'à 1998 dans le Bas-Congo, et puis le chemin de fer du Katanga, de Broken Hill à Elisabethville, et puis de Elisabethville à Bukama, et de Bukama à Ilebo, et puis le tronçon Tenke-Dilolo. Donc la construction a coûté la vie à plusieurs personnes, plusieurs Congolais. Et là, vous avez tout à fait raison de dire que le train apporte la mort. Mais après la construction du chemin de fer, le train n'a-t-il pas apporté la vie? Parce que nous avons, par exemple, le tronçon Elisabethville-Ilebo. Nous avons la transformation du paysage par le passage du train. Il y a des centres urbains qui ont été évincés en tant que chef-lieu de territoire par d'autres centres grâce au passage du train. Vous avez par exemple à Kamina, c'était le territoire de Mato, mais avec le passage du train à Kamina, c'est Kamina qui a évincé Mato. Il en est de même de Moneditu qui a évincé Kandakanda et de Luluabour en tant que chef-lieu du Kasaï, qui a évincé Lusambo, qui était l'ancien chef-lieu de territoire, à cause du passage du rail. Et vous avez aussi toutes les populations riveraines qui ont commencé à vivre grâce au rail parce que, en fait, quand le train amène les produits miniers, à son retour, c'est le maïs qu'il transporte vers les centres de consommation. Et donc, ces gens-là vivaient grâce au rail et se sont développés, si on peut dire comme ça, grâce au rail. Et enfin, vous avez maintenant une période où le rail change de fonction. Il y a des tronçons où le train ne passe plus. Et ces gens-là qui vivaient grâce au rail, là, c'est un peu la désolation. Hein, c'est un peu la désolation. Évidemment, je vais revenir là-dessus dans l'après-midi. Mais je voulais vous dire, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas moyen, par exemple, je ne sais pas si Uvira constitue quand même un cas spécifique, est-ce qu'Uvira n'a pas connu un impact positif à cause du rail de 1931 à 1957. Qu'est-ce que le rail a apporté? Pas la construction qui a tué, mais en fait le train aussi a apporté. Alors j'ai dit ceci, est-ce qu'on ne peut pas dire le train, la mort, la vie, la mort? Donc la mort, la construction, la vie, c'est le train qui roule maintenant, etc. Et puis la mort pour certaines régions qui, grâce au train qui ne circule plus, bon, c'est la désolation. Enfin, oui. Ce sont des propositions.
Oui. Très intéressante comme question. Vous dites un peu toute la critique des philosophes africains comme Fanon, Achille Mbembe ou Norman Adjari sur l'incapacité de certains concepts occidentaux de capter vraiment ce que vous dites, cette imbrication entre la vie et la mort. Parce que chez des philosophes comme Michel Foucault, on parle des biopolitiques ou de thanatopolitiques, des politiques de la mort, et que la mort, c'est ce qui met fin à la vie. Et dans la vie, il y a l'absence de la mort. Mais les gens en colonie ont expérimenté tout à fait le contraire. Le fait d'être mort dans la vie et le fait de pouvoir vivre dans la mort, c'est ce que Fanon appelle la mort atmosphérique. Et donc effectivement, lorsque le train arrive, c'est vraiment le train de la mort qui est en train de massacrer tout dans son environnement, à la fois la nature, les relations sociales, comme vous dites, c'est tout le bouleversement politique, social, environnemental qui se fait. Et donc c'est vraiment, les gens meurent, et pire, ils savent qu'ils risquent de mourir demain, d'une mort pire que celle qu'ils ont ratée aujourd'hui. Mais en même temps, et c'est la question de l'agency qui apparaît dans cette situation, c'est que les gens arrivent quand même à trouver des modalités de vie dans cette mort-là, des modalités de vie, et c'est ce que je disais par rapport à la manière, au rapport entre la mort et le temps, c'est que dans cette acception de la mort du train, on n'est pas dans une perspective définitive. C'est un peu ce que Deleuze considérait comme l'instinct de la mort, contrairement à Freud. C'est un instinct qui donne la mort, qui tue sur son passage, alors que chez Deleuze, ça laisse beaucoup de possibilités, de voies de sortie, même si l'enjeu au départ, c'est la mort. Et donc, cette idée-là, c'est que dans la mort, les gens essaient de se réinventer, de vivre. Donc, ce n'est pas spécifique à Uvira. Mais malgré l'agencéité, et c'est là que j'ai un problème souvent avec le concept de résilience, c'est qu'on va être en train de louer la manière dont les gens sont en train de survivre, comme s'ils n'étaient pas en train de souffrir dans leur chair. C'est ça le problème. Même si les gens arrivent à s'en sortir malgré tout, si vous allez sur le terrain, vous voyez vraiment la misère et la souffrance et des vies gâchées. Donc on ne peut pas se satisfaire, il me semble, du fait que les gens se sont réappropriés cette situation de vie et de mort, mais lorsqu'il est question de penser la vie, finalement la vie dans la mort, il s'agit en fait de proposer quelque chose de radicalement différent en se disant que pour eux, même si c'est des Noirs, ce qui compte, ce n'est pas la survie, mais vraiment la vie, en dehors de toute cette logique nécropolitique. Voilà.